It was the kind of late August heat that settled into the bones of a town and didn't let go until October. In Millhaven, Arkansas, population 4,200, summer of 1986 had been the driest anyone could remember. The creek beds were cracked and pale, the front lawns had gone the color of straw, and the only relief came after 9 in the evening, when a thin breeze finally moved through the cottonwood trees lining Ridgeline Road. People left their doors open then, screen doors only. That was the kind of town it was. On the evening of August 14th, Diane Coulter stepped out of her mother's house on the corner of Ridgeline and First Street, told her mother she'd see her at Sunday dinner, and walked toward her car. She was 31 years old. She had the keys to her car in one hand and a Tupperware container of leftover cornbread in the other. Her mother watched her from the porch until the headlights came on. Then the car pulled out of the gravel driveway, turned south toward the highway, and disappeared into the dark. It was the last time anyone who loved her would see her alive. Diane Coulter had lived in Millhaven her whole life. She'd gone to Millhaven Elementary, then Millhaven Junior High, then graduated from Millhaven High in 1973, the same class that still held its reunions at the VFW Hall on the edge of town, where the class portrait hung in the entryway and Diane was second from the left in the back row, laughing at something just off camera. By 1986, she worked the front desk at Cascade Family Medical, where she had been employed for 9 years. The doctors trusted her. The patients asked for her by name. She remembered which of the older men liked to be called by their first names, and which ones preferred a formal address, and she kept a dish of wrapped butterscotch candies next to the appointment book for children who had to get shots. She had thought about nursing school once. She still had the application in a drawer at home, filled out in her careful handwriting, never mailed. She had a daughter named Kayla, 7 years old, with her mother's brown eyes. Kayla spent most weekday evenings at her grandmother's house, while Diane worked the late afternoon shift, and the two of them had a ritual. Every Friday night, Diane would stop at the Piggly Wiggly on the way home and buy one small bag of Cheetos and one can of 7-Up, and they would watch Dallas together on the couch under a quilt her grandmother had made. Kayla would fall asleep before the episode ended, and Diane would carry her to bed without waking her. That Thursday evening, everything had been exactly as it always was. Diane had picked Kayla up, brought her to her mother's house for dinner, stayed too long, laughed too loud, and left later than she'd planned. The cornbread was extra. Her mother always made too much. She promised she'd call when she got home. The phone in her house rang until morning. No one answered. At 7:14 the next morning, Diane's 1982 Pontiac Sunbird was found by a county road crew on Route 9, approximately 4 miles south of the Millhaven town limits. The car was pulled onto the gravel shoulder, driver's door hanging open. The engine was cold. The keys were in the ignition. On the passenger seat, undisturbed, sat the Tupperware container of cornbread. The road crew called the sheriff's office at 7:19. By 8 a.m., 2 deputies had secured the scene. By 8:45, Diane's mother had been notified. By 9:30, she had already called the medical center, the neighbor across the street, Diane's cousin in Fort Smith, and the pastor of her church. By 10 that morning, the community of Millhaven understood that something was wrong. Detective Gerald Mays, then 44 years old, and in his 16th year with the Cascade County Sheriff's Office, was assigned the case the same afternoon. Mays was a methodical man, the kind of detective who hand-indexed his case files and would not go home until every note from that day had been written up properly. He had worked 4 homicides in his career. 2 were solved quickly. 1 was ongoing, and 1 still bothered him at night in a way he had stopped trying to explain. He took one look at Diane Coulter's abandoned car and said nothing for a long time. There was no sign of a struggle near the vehicle. No blood on or around the car. No skid marks indicating that she had braked hard or been forced from the road. The car had been parked carefully, almost deliberately, on a flat stretch of shoulder. Whatever had happened to Diane Coulter, it had not looked like an accident from the outside. One thing stood out. A section of gravel on the shoulder, roughly 8 feet behind the Pontiac, showed impressions consistent with a second vehicle having parked there. The impressions were faint, the ground was hard-baked from weeks of dry weather, but they were there. Someone had pulled off behind her. They had left before the road crew arrived. Mays had the impressions photographed and measured. He wrote it up in his notes. He circled it twice. In the days that followed, investigators canvassed the full stretch of Route 9 between Diane's mother's house and her own. They spoke to every gas station attendant, every resident whose house backed up toward the road, every trucker who had run that stretch regularly. They found 3 people who recalled seeing a light-colored car pulled over near Route 9 sometime the previous evening. None of them agreed on the time. None of them had seen a second vehicle. Diane's ex-husband, Barry Coulter, had moved to Texarkana in 1984 after their divorce and had a documented alibi, a poker game with 4 witnesses who all knew each other and had been interviewed separately. His story held. The men in Diane's life were few and uneventful. She had dated briefly over the previous year, but nothing serious. There was no one who stood out, no one who seemed wrong. By October, the active investigation had slowed. By December, Gerald Mays had been reassigned to 2 new cases. The file on Diane Coulter didn't close. That wasn't a thing they did. But it moved to a shelf, and the town of Millhaven, the way towns do, eventually began to breathe again and move forward around the empty space she'd left. Her mother never took down the photographs. Kayla Coulter grew up in Millhaven, raised largely by her grandmother. She did well in school. She was quiet and careful in the way children become when something enormous has happened to them young. By 1997, she was 18 years old and enrolled at Arkansas State. By 2002, she had graduated, married, moved to Little Rock. She called her grandmother every Sunday. She thought about her mother every day. The Cascade County Sheriff's Office had assigned Diane's case to a review list in 1992, which meant someone was supposed to look at it annually and note whether any new leads had surfaced. For most of the years between 1987 and 2003, those reviews were 1 paragraph long. No new information. File remains open. Gerald Mays retired in 1998. Before he cleaned out his desk, he made a photocopy of the Coulter case file and took it home in a cardboard box. Not because he was supposed to. Because he couldn't leave it there without knowing someone would still care about it. The box sat in his garage on a shelf between a socket wrench set and an old pair of hunting boots. In 2004, the reward poster that had been taped in the window of the Millhaven Diner since September 1986. The one with Diane's photo and the $2,000 reward that her mother's church congregation had raised, finally faded past the point of legibility. The diner's new owner, who had bought the place in 2001 and never known Diane personally, left it there anyway. Because enough people still remembered. And in a subdivision on the west side of Millhaven, on a quiet street with a basketball hoop in nearly every driveway, a man named Russell Dale Hutchins coached Little League for the Millhaven Parks Department, had done so for 11 years running, and was respected by every parent whose son had worn a jersey with his name on the roster sheet. He had been living there since 1984. He had a wife. He had a vinyl siding business. He attended the Baptist Church on Cedar. He had coached 83 boys through the fundamentals of fielding grounders and reading a curveball, and every spring he bought the whole team a round of ice cream when they won their first game. He had been in Millhaven the night Diane Coulter disappeared. No one had ever thought to look at him. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, pulling records, verifying details, and following the kind of paper trail that most people never know exists. If that kind of digging matters to you, if you believe the truth is worth finding no matter how long it takes, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is the reason we keep going. Now, let's get back to Diane. In January 2019, the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory began a systematic re-examination of biological evidence from unsolved cases that predated the widespread adoption of DNA testing. The Coulter case, flagged by Cascade County as a priority cold case, was included in the first review cycle. 2 items were still in evidence storage. One was a partial fiber recovered from the door frame of the Pontiac's driver's side, a fiber that had never been matched to any known source. The other was a cigarette butt recovered from the gravel shoulder near the tire impressions behind Diane's car, bagged and tagged in September 1986 by a deputy who had been thorough enough to document it, then never re-examined once the original investigation wound down. The cigarette butt had spent 32 years in a climate-controlled evidence locker. The DNA inside it had not. On the morning of March 11, 2019, a forensic analyst at the state lab named Karen Whitfield ran the extracted DNA profile against the FBI's CODIS database. No match came back. Standard outcome. Expected, she moved to the next step, uploading the profile to a public genealogy platform, the same kind of site where ordinary people submit saliva samples to trace great-grandparents and map out family trees going back to the 1800s. The technique, known as investigative genetic genealogy, works by finding relatives who share portions of DNA with an unknown sample, then tracing the family tree outward and back until a single living individual emerges who could be the source. It is patient work. It does not always find the answer. Sometimes it narrows to 5 people. Sometimes it narrows to 1. By late April, Whitfield and a genealogist consultant had followed the DNA branches far enough to identify 3 possible living males who could be the contributor. All of them in a 15-year age range. All of them from the broader region. 2 were in Louisiana. 1 was in Arkansas. His name was Russell Dale Hutchins. Whitfield flagged the file and called the Cascade County investigator assigned to the case, a detective named Lynn Archer, who had taken it on 3 years earlier and had never met Diane Coulter, but had spoken at length with Diane's daughter Kayla and had kept a photograph on her desk of a woman laughing at something off camera, second from the left in the back row. "We've got a name," Whitfield said. "We need you to collect a voluntary sample for confirmation." Archer set down her pen, read the name twice. Then she opened a search window on her computer and typed it in, and what came back stopped her cold. Russell Dale Hutchins. Millhaven, vinyl siding. Little League coach, 1991 through 2004. Current address, Millhaven, Arkansas. He had never left town. Investigators did not approach Hutchins directly. Instead, they obtained a discarded DNA sample, a coffee cup, collected from outside a diner where Hutchins was known to eat breakfast on Tuesday mornings, and submitted it for confirmatory testing against the sample from the 1986 evidence locker. The match was unambiguous. On June 3, 2019, Russell Dale Hutchins was arrested at his home on Creekside Drive in Millhaven by Cascade County Sheriff's detectives and an Arkansas State Police officer. He was 61 years old. He was wearing a Millhaven Little League t-shirt the kind they sold at the concession stand for fundraising. His wife watched from the front doorway. The warrant charged him with first-degree murder in the death of Diane Marie Coulter. By that afternoon, Millhaven was having conversations that it didn't have the vocabulary for. The parents of boys Russell Hutchins had coached, the neighbors who had waved to him from their driveways, the people who had stood next to him in the pew at Cedar Baptist and shaken his hand after service for decades. None of them had a word for what it meant to learn that the man who had handed their son a trophy at the end-of-season banquet had also, on an August evening in 1986, followed a woman down a dark county road and taken everything from her. One father whose son had played third base for Hutchins in 1999 told a local reporter, "I don't know what to do with it. I honestly don't know what to do with it." Under questioning, Hutchins initially denied any knowledge of Diane Coulter. Then he claimed they had known each other casually and had a brief encounter that evening that was consensual. Then, on the third day of questioning, facing the DNA evidence and a forensic reconstruction of tire tread patterns that matched the 1986 impressions to a vehicle model consistent with what Hutchins had driven at the time, he changed his account again. He did not confess in full. He never would. But in a recorded interview on June 5, 2019, he said 4 words that his attorney would later try to suppress and fail. "I didn't mean it." In March 2021, after delays caused by the pandemic, Russell Dale Hutchins was convicted of first-degree murder by a Cascade County jury after 6 hours of deliberation. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. His wife, who had attended every day of the trial, did not return for the sentencing. Kayla Coulter was 39 years old when she sat in a Cascade County courtroom and heard the jury foreperson say the word guilty. She had driven from Little Rock alone because she had wanted to be alone with the moment, to not have to hold anyone else's reaction before she had finished having her own. She told a journalist from the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette that she had been waiting so long to feel the thing she thought she would feel when it ended that she wasn't entirely sure what to call it. "It wasn't happiness," she said. "I don't think that's the right word. It was more like something finally stopped. Like a sound you've been hearing so long you forgot it was there." Her mother's case changed 3 things in Cascade County. It was cited in a 2020 legislative push to fund a permanent cold case review unit within the state crime lab, a unit that, by 2023, had re-examined biological evidence from 41 additional unsolved cases and generated 3 additional arrests. It prompted the county to digitize and re-inventory its pre-1995 evidence storage, a process that uncovered 17 previously uncatalogued items from other open cases. And it put Russell Dale Hutchins's name permanently in the public record next to his crime, which means that every child who ever looked up to him, every parent who ever shook his hand, now knows exactly who he was. Gerald Mays learned about the arrest from his daughter, who had seen it on the news. He was 77 years old by then, living in retirement outside of Conway. His daughter said he sat very still when she told him, and then he went to the garage and came back carrying a cardboard box. He'd kept it for 33 years. He called Cascade County the next morning and offered to bring it in. The detective who answered the phone was Lynn Archer. She told him to come whenever he was ready. He drove down the following week. Diane Coulter was 31 years old on the last night of her life. She was carrying cornbread she'd made herself, in a container she never got to return. She had a daughter with brown eyes and a quilt on the couch, and a Friday night ritual that had become, in the absence of her, the thing her daughter would hold on to the longest. She had an application for nursing school in a drawer. She had a mother who kept every photograph. She had neighbors who recognized her in the second row of a class portrait, more than 30 years after it was taken. She deserved better than what happened on Route 9 in August of 1986. She deserved someone who looked harder and earlier at the man who had never left town, who had gone on to coach children and sell siding and sit in church pews while her mother aged and her daughter grew up without her. Truth found her. It took 33 years. It came from a cigarette butt in a labeled evidence bag that a careful deputy had thought to collect, and from a genealogy database, and from a woman named Karen Whitfield who followed one branch of a family tree far enough to find a name, and from Gerald Mays, who couldn't leave a file behind without knowing someone still cared. Some questions stay with us. Was there something? One early lead, one moment of sharper scrutiny that could have closed this case in the 1980s? Before Russell Hutchins spent decades living freely in the town where he killed someone? What does it mean for a community when the evidence of evil was always present, but the capacity to read it came a generation too late? And for Kayla Coulter, who carried her mother's absence her entire life and then sat alone in a courtroom to hear a verdict, what does justice look like when it arrives 33 years after the crime? Leave your thoughts below. We read every comment. Justice found Diane Coulter after 33 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Thank you for being here.